You don't crave validation. You crave proof that you matter. You post something online, a photo, a thought, something you're proud of, and then you wait. Not because you need to, but because something inside you demands to know how it will be received. 5 minutes pass, then 10. You check again. How many likes? What did people say? And when the notifications start coming in, you feel something shift. Not happiness, exactly. Relief. Because for a brief moment, you've received confirmation that you exist in a way that matters, that you're seen, that you're acceptable. And then the feeling fades, and the hunger returns. This isn't vanity. It's not superficiality. It's something far more fundamental and far more universal. Because the need for validation doesn't start with social media. It doesn't start with likes or followers or public approval. It starts much earlier. In childhood, in relationships, in every moment you ever adjusted yourself. Your words, your opinions, your behavior, to fit what you believed would make you worthy of love. And that pattern? It never really stopped. You just learned to hide it better. You learned to call it confidence when you felt validated, and insecurity when you didn't. What most people never realize is that the validation trap isn't about wanting approval. It's about needing it to feel real, to feel like you matter, to feel like your existence has been acknowledged and accepted by the world around you. And the cost of that need isn't just exhaustion from performing, it's something deeper. It's the quiet erosion of your ability to know who you are when no one is watching. But here's the part that changes everything. The trap wasn't built by you. It was built into you. And understanding why means going back to the beginning. You're not tired because you're busy. You're tired because you're performing. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you've done. It's the exhaustion of adjusting yourself. Your words, your tone, your opinions, to fit what you believe will make you acceptable, likable, worthy of approval. And if you've spent years doing this, you already know the cost. Not just the effort it takes to constantly monitor how you're being received, but the quiet erosion of knowing who you actually are when no one is watching. Most people assume the need for validation is about insecurity, about low self-esteem, about needing attention. But it's not that simple, because the hunger for approval doesn't come from weakness. It comes from something much older, an evolutionary survival mechanism that once kept your ancestors alive by ensuring they remained accepted by the tribe. And now, in a world that no longer treats exile as death, that same mechanism still runs in the background of your mind, constantly scanning, constantly adjusting, constantly seeking confirmation that you exist in a way that matters. In the next 12 minutes, you're going to understand why you crave validation, not as a moral failing, but as a psychological pattern with deep evolutionary roots. Why external approval never feels like enough. Why disapproval feels so personal. And most importantly, how to step out of a system that keeps you performing for an audience that will never be satisfied. This isn't about becoming indifferent to others. It's about becoming aligned with yourself. And once you see the validation trap clearly, you'll never mistake approval for freedom again. Picture this. You're in a conversation. Someone asks for your opinion on something. And before you answer, there's a split second, so brief you barely notice it, where your mind does something subtle. It scans the room, reads the faces, tries to predict what answer will land well, what will make you seem thoughtful, reasonable, likable, and then you speak. Not necessarily what you actually think, but what you've calculated will be received the way you want it to be. The words come out smoothly, naturally, and no one notices the calculation that happened just before, except you. And even you barely noticed. Or maybe it's a different version. You accomplish something you worked hard for, something you're genuinely proud of. But instead of the pride being enough, you feel an immediate pull to share it, to post it, to tell someone. Not because you want to celebrate, but because the achievement doesn't feel fully real until it's been witnessed, until someone else confirms that it matters, that you did well, that you're worthy of recognition. And when that confirmation comes, you feel validated. But when it doesn't, or when it's less enthusiastic than you hoped, the accomplishment itself starts to feel smaller, less real, as if your experience required external approval to become legitimate. Here's what's happening beneath the surface. Every time you adjust your behavior to secure approval, you're reinforcing a belief system that's been with you since you were young. The belief that your value is determined by how others perceive you. That acceptance is conditional. That love, connection, and belonging must be earned by performing the right version of yourself. And the more you perform, the more disconnected you become from the version of you that exists when no one is watching, the part that doesn't need to be validated because it simply is. But that part, it gets quieter every time you choose approval over authenticity. And eventually, you forget it was ever there. But here's the deeper truth no one talks about. The hunger for validation isn't a personal failing. It's an evolutionary inheritance. And it's time to understand where it actually came from. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, the need for validation isn't a bug in your programming, it's a feature. For hundreds of thousands of years, your survival depended entirely on your standing within the tribe. Being accepted, valued, and respected by your group wasn't optional. It was the difference between protection and exile, between eating and starving, between living and dying. Your ancestors who were hyper-attuned to social approval, who constantly monitored how they were perceived and adjusted accordingly, were the ones who survived long enough to pass on their genes. And you inherited that system. You inherited a brain that treats social rejection like a physical threat. This is why criticism doesn't just hurt your feelings. It activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Studies using fMRI scans show that social exclusion lights up the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, the same regions that process bodily pain. Your brain genuinely cannot distinguish between being physically injured and being socially rejected. To your nervous system, they are the same category of threat, which is why a dismissive comment from someone you respect can ruin your entire day. Why being ignored in a group conversation can feel like being attacked. Why you can logically know that someone's opinion shouldn't matter, and still feel devastated when they withhold their approval. But here's where it gets more complex. The validation trap doesn't just make you crave approval. It makes you crave it from the wrong sources. Psychologist Carl Rogers identified this as the difference between conditional positive regard and unconditional positive regard. Conditional regard is love and acceptance that must be earned through performance, achievement, or compliance. Unconditional regard is acceptance that exists simply because you exist. Most people grow up receiving primarily conditional regard. You're praised when you succeed, ignored when you don't, loved when you behave a certain way, criticized when you don't. And your brain learns a brutal lesson that your worth is something you must constantly prove, not something you inherently possess. This creates what psychologists call an external locus of validation, a state where your sense of self-worth is entirely dependent on external feedback. You don't feel good about yourself because you know you did well. You feel good because someone told you that you did well. And the moment that external validation stops, your confidence collapses because it was never rooted in you. It was borrowed, rented, contingent on the approval of others. And the more you rely on external validation, the more fragile your self-concept becomes, because it's being built on a foundation that shifts every time someone changes their mind about you. But the trap goes even deeper than dependency, because the real cost isn't just what you lose, it's what you never build in the first place. Let's make this concrete. Think about the last time you posted something on social media. Not a casual story. Something you actually cared about. A thought, an achievement, a moment you wanted to share. You hit post. And then what? You waited. Maybe you told yourself you didn't care about the response, but you checked. 5 minutes later, 10, 20. And every time you looked, your brain was doing a calculation, not just counting likes, measuring your worth, interpreting silence as rejection, interpreting engagement as approval. And when the response was strong, you felt relief. But when it was weak, you felt something closer to shame, not because the post was bad, but because the lack of validation felt like evidence that you weren't enough in that moment. Or consider this pattern. You're in a meeting. Someone proposes an idea. You have a strong opinion, a genuine insight that could shift the conversation. But before you speak, you pause, not to think, to assess. Will this make me look smart? Will it challenge the wrong person? Will I seem difficult? And in that pause, your authentic response softens. What comes out instead is a carefully edited version, safe, acceptable, likely to be received well, and it works. People nod. You blend in, but something else happens too. The part of you that had something real to say learns that visibility carries risk. That approval feels safer than honesty, and over time, that subtle trade-off becomes a habit. Not because you're weak, but because your brain is trying to protect you. Here's a third version most people recognize but rarely name. You're scrolling through social media and you see someone, friend, acquaintance, stranger, living a life that looks more validated than yours, more celebrated, more visibly approved, and instead of feeling neutral, you feel smaller. Not jealous, exactly, just diminished, as if their recognition highlights your lack of it. And that feeling, it's not really about them, it's about comparison, about a system that constantly invites you to measure yourself against everyone else, and rarely allows you to win. External validation doesn't stabilize your sense of worth. It makes it conditional, and anything conditional can disappear. But here's where the deeper shift begins, because once you see the pattern clearly, you can start separating who you are from how you're received. The first shift you need to make is understanding that validation seeking isn't something you can simply stop through willpower. It's a deeply wired pattern built from years of conditioning. But what you can do is recognize it, and recognition changes your position. The moment you notice the pattern, you step slightly outside of it. When you catch yourself adjusting your words to please someone, don't judge it. Just observe it. When you feel the pull to check how your post was received, pause. Notice the impulse, because awareness creates distance, and distance creates choice. You can't change a pattern you don't see, but once you see it clearly, it stops running entirely on autopilot. The second shift involves building what psychologists call an internal locus of validation. This doesn't mean never caring what anyone thinks. That's unrealistic and unnecessary. What it means is developing the ability to confirm your own value independent of external feedback. And this begins with something deceptively simple: self-verification. Instead of waiting for someone else to decide whether you did well, you decide. Not through empty affirmations, but through honest evaluation. You assess your effort, your alignment, your integrity, based on your own standards, and over time, something stabilizes. Not your reputation, your center. Because when validation comes from within, it can't be withdrawn by someone else. The third shift is the most liberating: learning to tolerate disapproval without reorganizing yourself around it. Not everyone will agree with you. Not everyone will approve of your choices. And that isn't a flaw. It's evidence that you have a perspective of your own. The validation trap convinces you that disapproval is dangerous, that rejection is a verdict. But it isn't. It's information. And information doesn't define you. It simply reflects preference. When you stop interpreting disapproval as a threat, you stop reshaping yourself to avoid it. And that's when something quiet but powerful happens. You begin choosing authenticity over approval. And that choice? That's where real confidence starts. Here is the truth that rewrites the entire pattern. You were never supposed to be universally approved of. That was never the goal. That was never even possible. The version of you that tries to earn validation from everyone is not your highest self. It's your most exhausted self, because universal approval requires universal performance, and universal performance requires you to become someone different in every room you enter. You fragment, you adapt, you calculate, and eventually you lose track of which version was real, because none of them were allowed to be fully expressed. The validation trap taught you that your worth is contingent, that it must be earned, maintained, and constantly defended. But that was never true. Your worth isn't a grade you receive from the world. It's not a metric that rises and falls based on how many people approve of you. It's something deeper, something quieter, something that exists whether anyone notices or not. And the moment you stop looking outside yourself for confirmation of that, the trap begins to loosen. Not because you stopped valuing connection, but because you stopped believing that connection requires you to disappear. The freedom you've been searching for doesn't come from being liked by more people. It comes from being aligned with yourself. And alignment requires you to stop performing, to stop calculating, to stop reshaping yourself into versions that feel safe but hollow. It requires you to show up as you are, flawed, uncertain, imperfect, and trust that the people who matter will meet you there. Not everyone will, and that's the cost of authenticity. But the alternative, spending your life performing for an audience that will never be satisfied, doesn't just cost you approval, it costs you alignment. approval feels safe. Alignment feels free. The next time you feel that familiar pull to adjust yourself for approval, to edit your words, soften your opinion, or perform a version of yourself that feels safer, pause for a moment and ask yourself this: whose approval am I seeking? And what part of me shifts when I do? Because the validation you're chasing isn't worth the cost if it requires you to distance yourself from the version of you that doesn't need permission to exist. The validation trap taught you that approval equals safety. That being liked means being worthy. That external confirmation is the only way to know you matter. But none of that was ever true. You were never meant to be universally approved of. You were meant to be yourself, fully, honestly, imperfectly, and let the right people recognize you there. Not everyone will. And that isn't failure. That's alignment. Approval feels safe. Alignment feels free. And ask yourself this: what would you say, do, or become if you stopped performing for an audience that was never meant to define you? If this changed how you see validation, tell me in the comments. I'd love to know what resonated with you. To continue this understanding, watch the next video here, and to understand human behavior at a deeper level, subscribe. We decode psychology every week.